Hi, welcome to this overview of terrestrial survey techniques. What I want to do is I want to give you an insight into this very complex looking diagram here, but I just want you to kind of get familiar with the terminology. So if I was to say, please go to the west of Ireland and take a representative part of the landscape and I want you to sample that, this might be something that you'd be presented with, this type of landscape. So the entire area that I want you to survey is called the sample area or the sampling universe. And of course, it's impossible to go and sample every single bit of that. So we have to break it down and make it more manageable for ourselves. And then we'll bring along our strata, our habitat, our vegetation type, management type, whatever way we decide to break it down. Of course, if you think about it, peatland, grassland, woodland, all three blocks are present here, and that's the acre scoring system. And then what you want to do is you want to go, within that peatland or within that grassland, it's impossible for me to sample every single section of that. So how am I going to break it down even further? So in ecology, there's two main ways we do it. We do it in terms of quadrats, that's a kind of square shape, or a line. So literally walking along that line and picking up what's going along it. So the latter one there, the transect, that's what's been adapted for the acre scoring system. So again, this is all rooted in serious ecological science, and the data is there that justifies using this, but it's just been adapted for the acre scoring system. So just very briefly, you're never going to get all of the plants. Your subsample is to make it more manageable. Reduces your cost and time and effort, but it's meant to be representative. So in other words, it is meant to give you an indication or an insight into what is there. So looking at these two pictures here side by side, so two different types of grasslands, what's the two main differences there? Well, the first is the types of plants, so the presence of the plants. Here on the left hand side, we've got mainly grasses. On the right hand side, you can see a lot of oxide daisy there, and there'll be other plants in between there. So plants, bioindicators or indicators of the type of management, both in the present and in the past. And we're also looking at the abundance or the cover of the plants. So you might just find one oxide daisy cropping up, but that's not going to be the bioindicator that this is optimal for species-rich plant diversity. So you want the two things acting side by side. And it just so happens that when we look at, our plants and we've decided how we're going to sample them, what we need to decide to do next is what attributes or aspects of plants, because there's lots of different things that could be measured or analysed or sampled. And here on the left-hand side, I've got some examples there. So frequency, you put down lots of quadrats or plots, and you figure out in how many of those the plant would occur, density, how many plants are there in a given area. That's generally used for woodland plants. Biomass, you cut plants and then figure out just how much weight there is or dry matter weight there is in a given area. We don't tend to look at that because that takes time and effort unless we're specifically looking at those and changes in those. So we tend to look at it as the two types that I just talked to you about, which is what plants are present, so identification, and how much space do they take up. So those across the board are the most commonly used plant attributes. So again, we're using what's been done in ecology, what's typically done in ecology in terms of plants, and we're translating that into the acre scoring system. So here is a quadrat. So this is your generally the most common field survey technique, this quadrat. So it's usually square, and in grasslands we're usually measuring 2 meters by 2 meters. That just is the kind of common survey area. And what you'd have to do is you'd have to go in there and you'd have to identify and record all the plant species that are present. And then for each one of those plant species that are present, you'd be estimating the cover of those species. And then you might take other information like what type of soil is it, what's the aspect, is there a steep slope, is there any indication that this is under optimal or less than optimal ground conditions or plant conditions? but that all takes time. So when I've been doing quadrats before, it could take us up to 2 hours to complete a quadrat. And usually you do about 4 of those in a kind of in a day. So that would be quite labor intensive. And one of the other things that you're thinking about is across a field, plants don't tend to occur in a regular pattern. They tend to do these two things here. They're either randomly distributed, but they're never randomly distributed, or there's something called contagious or kind of clustered. And what that tends to mean is they kind of cluster around the areas where they like to grow, or some of them might kind of not care where they want to grow and be spread more evenly outside or in that area. But in general, you're never going to put a quadrat down and get all the plants that you want to take in that area. So that's why you have to do a number of different quadrats. And then you have to think about, well, how am I going to place those quadrats? And again, think of your peatland, your grassland, your woodland. So those are the different strata, the different colours here. And you might decide to put down a number of plots, a number of quadrats, and you have to make sure that you're going to equally sample the area or the vegetation that you're looking at. So with that in mind, when we were thinking about the acre scoring system in the very beginning, looking at Leitrim, we recognised that a quadrat is very good for giving us serious scientific data, but what we needed was something more rapid assessment that still gave us the same optimal outcome in terms of understanding what was happening in the grassland. And so what we went for there was this point quadrat. So literally it's walking through your grass, and you can see almost like a W here, and putting a point down and a point down and a point down and going, well, what's growing there, what's growing there? You see that we're covering more ground, including vegetation that's within the quadrat. We're covering more of the area of this grassland. So this is a point quadrat, and there's your point quadrat. So W-shaped walk through the field, it's a point quadrat. So we're walking kind of transect or line transect, but each one of those we're taking a point. And a quadrat is just a small area of space that you're sampling in. So literally looking at the toe of your welly, that's your quadrat. Ticking all the positive and negative indicators, well, that's the presence of species that we said was one of the most commonly measured attributes. And cover, see how many plants you're finding or coming across as you walk through the W. Again, finding how all of that serious science, putting it into the kind of more rapid and more readily usable acres scoring system. And just to harken back to the Habitats Directive. So the Habitats Directive is one of the major pieces of legislation that we have in Europe that protects different types of habitats and species. What you have to do is every 6 years, you have to go along and you have to see, well, how are these habitats doing? Are they in good condition or not? And one of the things, or one of the aspects that's measured is something called structure and function. And in structure and function, you actually look at the typical plant species and you see, are they present and in what condition they're present. So just for example, I took here blanket bogs, and you can see the list of species, so the common name and the scientific name, and there's 2 sample indicators there, and they will also occur in the acre scoring system. And looking at it more widely, this is all of the attributes that would be measured for structure and function on a blanket bog for that annex habitat assessment. And you can hopefully start to see where some of the acre scoring systems come from. So a number of positive indicators. So we have positive indicators. At the cover of different indicators. So bryophytes or liophytes, bryophytes or lichens. The cover of negative indicators. The cover of non-native species. What's the vegetation structure like? Is there lots of sphagnum, or is it under a bit of pressure? Is there signs of burning? Is there signs of disturbed or bare ground? So again, when the acres, or when the scoring system or the results-based scoring system was being developed, through the Burn and through the Orbach project, we went to this type of gold standard, and we took this and we translated it into something that's usable on a wider scale. And also, one of the things that you have to do when you look at the EU habitats that are protected is look to see, well, what are the impacts or pressures and threats? And they have a long list of pressures and threats, and they've all got different impact codes. And again, you would do that for these annex habitats, but we also do it in the acre scoring system. You're looking to see what threats might be coming along to that particular grassland or habitat that you're looking at. And very quickly, I just want to tell you about assessing cover. So cover is one of the things that people find a little bit difficult. So it's the area that's taken up by a plant, and that really impacts on the amount of, I suppose, dominance that that plant has in a system. So we like to know which plants have most cover in a system. In this case, if you think not just in terms of plants, but in terms of positive indicator plants, we'd like to understand how much those positive indicator plants take up within the habitat that we're looking at. It's very difficult to go around and go, they take up 55% of that area, or 62%, because that's quite difficult to measure. So what I'm showing you here is something called cover abundance classes. So when we're working with students, we would get them to use the Doman cover scale. And that's quite nicely divided up there into 10 different units. But when you're doing the acre scoring system, you want to be a little bit more user-friendly or rapid than this. So that's why it was translated into this, which was, and you've seen this before, there's your line transect. You're stopping at points along here. So what you're doing is looking at your feet as you go along, how much positive indicators are cropping up as you walk along there. So again, very high, you're encountering multiple positive indicators at every step and in between steps. So you're seeing them everywhere you go. So that's how cover was integrated into the acre scoring system. So that's a very rapid run through the acre scoring system in terms of, the science behind the vegetation, sampling and cover assessment.